Good morning, everyone. This is Mark Burgess with the Department of Commerce and Economic Opportunity. Welcome again to our Wednesday webinars for WIOA implementation. We appreciate everyone joining us. As always, looks like we're going to have a large crowd. Probably have a few more coming in after 10 o'clock. We won't go through too much housekeeping, as I think most people have already attended these, but if you would please mute your phones unless you have something verbally you want to discuss. You can make comments either over the phone or in the chat pod to your left. There's a document in the lower left-hand column in the file download pod available, and you see that kind of uploaded below our welcome message. That's the information we're going to discuss today. We're not going to go, what it is the eligibility documentation sources. We're not actually going into the policies necessarily unless part of the discussion warrants referring back to the policies that have been developed. We've already had a couple webinars on eligibility. Those policy letters are very near completion, and so we are hoping that those will be approved and signed off and issued next week. But we really don't want to focus on those policies, like I said, because we've had discussions in the past on those. We've made necessary changes based on those discussions, and so we are pretty close to finalizing those. So we're just going to utilize the documentation sources for this webinar. Jim Potts is here to help us with that discussion. Also, I know Jennifer Butler, maybe Bethany with KEB are available if there are questions that relate more to the policies, as they are the ones that are drafting those and finalizing those for us. One thing to keep in mind with this documentation sources document, it began from the old policy 12, most people refer to it as the eligibility policy under WIA. We decided to do a little bit of different format, so you'll see a 3 or a 2 column in some instances, multiple tables in this document. The far left is the requirement by WIOA or the NPRM. The middle column are clarifying information, and in many of these there wasn't any necessity to have clarifying information, so if it's blank, that was purposefully done. And then on the right side will be all of those documentation sources. As Jim goes through these, he'll highlight especially the ones that have been added, or the majority of them, but you'll note there are a lot of additions to the source listing compared to what was there under the old policy 12. So keep in mind with that, one of the major ones, as you'll see initially under the general eligibility, is that there's a lot of documents we are now allowing as long as they're not expired. So you'll see that first word is say unexpired. Many documents, once they're expired, are no longer allowed, so make sure the career planners understand that. And so we want to make sure all the staff have this. This is in draft form because we have one final review to do before we issue it with the policy. So while we think this is 90+%, 95+% complete and accurate, please look forward to those policy issuances for the final version of this in case there might be some changes to what's on the right-hand list. One thing to keep in mind with this, let me go ahead and pull that document up for you in a larger version. Chelsea with WorkNet has chat pod to the left. Dialing in. Again, please, if you would please mute your phones, and at the point in time where you want to talk, you can go ahead and unmute it and step into the conversation with comments or questions. But please, everyone, mute those phones until that point in time. Thank you. As you'll see, we've laid this out kind of the way we've laid out the new policy, and we're going to have separate policies. For those of you that have been in the discussions with the eligibility policies a month or two ago, we will have separate policies for all the types of eligibility. So we have a general eligibility that applies to everybody, or at least the majority of people. There are a couple requirements that apply only to adults and dislocated workers, not to youth, but we still put that in a general eligibility category rather than repeat it in the separate adult and dislocated worker policies. So you'll see the headers on these tables reflect those policies. You'll have a general eligibility, an adult section, a dislocated worker section, a youth section that includes both out-of-school youth and in-school youth. And then at the bottom of the document, we've included some additional information that relates to ensuring you've ensured the identity of the individual, as well as veterans. And then finally, we've got a section on low income, because while low income is an income eligibility issue, it's kind of a subset of the eligibility, so we put it in a separate section. Plus, low income applies to more than just eligibility, and so in that policy letter, as we refer to low income, we'll also refer to those other areas that low income comes into play. So, as I said, there's 3 columns here. Above, you'll see the opening statements that say this is for all Title IB registered participants. As we all know, we are in a new age with WIOA where we're working with all of our agency partners, especially those core partners. So there may be some instances where we have to make changes to our policies based on future discussions between those interagency groups, where we want to include things that might apply to them. But at this point in time, we're referring only to Title IB in this document. Self-attestation is a very important part of ensuring eligibility, or at least documenting eligibility. We want to make sure everyone is aware that self-attestation is the last resort for documentation source. If you see in this listing of documentation sources another form of allowable source, you need to utilize that if it's available. Only rely on self-attestation when that customer can't provide any of the other items that are on these lists. So we wanted to make that clear, and so we highlighted that by putting it at the top of our bar up there. As I said when I started out, you'll see in this list to the right for documentation sources for authorized to work quite a few additions that weren't in the old policy. So that'll help you as a career planner in getting your customers identified properly and the proper documentation behind it. What I want to do is jump to the bottom of this first set for a moment, because you'll see a note here that says, in addition to ensuring that someone is authorized to work in the United States, you have to ensure that they are who they are. So you have to ensure their identity, and you have to ensure that they're eligible to actually be employed, which is a little bit different than authorized to work. And what that means is when you see this list, you can then take that further down to page 20, which I'm going to scroll down there real quick. And you'll see this listing. And I want to just make clear what this is, and then when we get to it later on, we can go over what's here. But just because somebody walks in and one of the first items of documentation source for authorized to work in the United States is a birth certificate issued by a state, county, or property of the United States, something that shows that you were born in the United States or one of its properties. However, just because a customer walks in the door with a birth certificate does not prove the person handing you that birth certificate is that individual. So we want to make sure that we are identifying that the individual is who they say they are. And that's why we've added this chart or table to this document, so that you know what other sources you might need to utilize to ensure the identity and or employment eligibility. We won't go into that table any more than that until we get to it later in the discussion, but I just wanted to point out that is part of the career planning process, career planner's process in ensuring identity and employability, I guess. And so with that, we'll go to the authorized to work in the United States section. Okay, we've got 2 questions. First, Karen's asking, we don't distinguish between unexpired or expired in regards to a permanent resident card. You will find some of these where it doesn't matter whether it's unexpired or expired. We identified that on a U.S. passport because basically some of the documents, once you're identified as being eligible or authorized to work in the United States through those documents, U.S. passport being one, that will never change. If you got a U.S. passport at one point in time in your life, even if it is expired, your status as being authorized to work in the United States will never change because you were born here or however you were eligible to get that U.S. passport, that can't change. So Karen's asking specifically about the one for permanent resident card, and Jim, should there be an unexpired or expired reference on that as well?
Here's the take on anybody that you're needing INS documentation. The whole goal is not just to get the person in our program. The goal is for once the person's through the program, can they gain employment? So anytime we're looking for a client that's on the form of INS, if, like when I read that question, permanent to me means that this person's going to be here forever. So I presume that's stating that they're going to be able to work in the United States. If you have any doubt that that document is not going to support them being eligible to work in the United States, find one of those choices on the INS that isn't expired. That's all coming back to once a client's through the program, if we find out all of a sudden they can't get a job because we didn't capture or make sure we had appropriate documentation to support the client's authorized to work, it's still going to be on us because you have to make sure. So anybody that's not made in America, born in America or naturalized, you have just to make sure that your documentation is going to be able to support the end result. Can this person get a job once they've completed services? Because especially adult dislocated worker, that's what your performance outcomes are all based on. Are these people going to have a job or are they going to keep a job through the second and fourth quarter post-exit? So when you see things that you have little questions on, that's the thought process always should be, is this person going to be able to get a job? So when you research that, maybe we should remove the one that says unexpired on that. You guys probably know more than I on that. So that could be something that could be researched. But the biggest thought process should always be, especially for somebody that's not born in the United States, to make sure that we're capturing the documentation that supports that this person can get a job once they're through services.
Yeah, from a policy standpoint, we don't get a lot of those questions as you from the local areas send those to Jim. He comes to us quite a bit on those to get some clarification or at least forward information on to us. But you in the field really are the ones that see these every day, all these various situations and scenarios. And sometimes you can do the research and find out yourself, and maybe you don't present that to us, and so we don't know of a scenario that you have encountered. But by all means, as we go through all these webinars, I continue to impress on everyone that you can always email us with information. If you feel there should be something added to a document, whether it be this table or our draft policies, or a change or a clarification, please let us know. So with eligibility, most people will contact Jim, and that's great. He'll contact us when necessary in policy. But again, since we don't have that day-to-day contact with customers, we really don't know all the different scenarios. And so we rely on you guys to present those to us. And that way we can add those to a document so that everybody has that information. It's not just one-on-one. If you respond to us with a comment or a question and we reply to that, we want to make sure everyone understands that same clarification. So feel free, if you've got these situations, to email those to Jim when they rely to eligibility or whomever, if it's another topic that is associated with that here at OET, and so that we can clarify as best possible in either guidance or some type of other document that we might be issued. Mike Williams has mentioned
let me just piggyback right on that thought process, Mark. One of the things for those of you who are still using our only document that's out there is the old eligibility policy manual for authorized to work. One of the things you're going to notice on this new document, things that have been removed from authorized to work were, in the past we had work experience pay records. That's gone now. Public assistance printouts, that's gone now. That's not a choice. Food stamp records, that's been removed as a choice for authorized to work. So what it's back to is more of the updated items, because our eligibility policy manual was put out, that version in 2002. So those lists are documents on there for alien registration have been replaced over the years. So hopefully this new source docs that we have the more up-to-date, correct documentation for the alien registrations. So that's one of the biggest things probably, because what I'd see in the past is people would use a pay stub for somebody who maybe was on an INS who had worked before and now couldn't get employment. But they just got them in the system using a pay stub for authorized work. So you'll notice those things are removed, and I think that should hopefully help in a lot of situations. So again, the documentation sources, like Mark said, if you find any new, and especially beyond like the INS forms, if we don't have a correct version on there or there's a more up-to-date, if you could let us know, that would be really helpful.
Okay, we've got a couple other comments. Mike and Rory both have said there's other systems that maybe staff can use to verify somebody's authorization to work in the United States, E-Verify being one, or an IDS system called SAVE. Are those acceptable for everybody, Jim, to utilize those, and then do they just case note that they've actually verified it?
If you have something that you know is 100% that's allowable, I'd prefer you guys send that to us now, and we could incorporate it into our policy if we have that. And that way we could put it into a drop-down. There is going to be, if you look at the bottom of it's on page 2 of 24, and it talks now about the list of acceptable documentations used on I-9. If some of those documents are on that I-9, that will be a choice you can use. In IWS, it'll have a selection choice along the lines of I-9 documentation. And so if that is covered under that, maybe it could fit in there, or if it's something separate, if you could just forward up and we could add it to this choices, it'd be great.
Hey, Jim, this is
Yes.
Mike in Chicago.
Yep.
On some of these forms from like INS, when they expire, there's language on the back of the card that says they're still valid for up to 1 year. Is that going to still apply?
Well, that's the same thought process again, Mike. If it's valid for just 1 year, the person has to get through services and they have to gain employment, and your measures are second and fourth quarter post-exit. So if it's
But
valid for a year,
it's a valid card still.
well, I understand, but that's getting that person in the program.
Yeah, but Jim, this is Amy.
Yeah.
We're talking about eligibility. So at the point of eligibility, the person is eligible.
I understand that, Amy.
I understand, Jim, but that's what we're talking about, eligibility.
For eligibility, I think you're correct. You could utilize that, but I think
Right.
what Jim's saying, and I think you're understanding it, Amy, is we want to look long-term, and just because they're eligible and could get a job today, and they're going into a 2-year training program, but their eligibility to work in this country expires
right.
before that 2 years.
I understand what Jim is
We got to make
saying.
sure there's two subjects here we're talking about.
Right, and I want to make sure we're clear on this end. We'll worry about the performance
Yeah.
on our end, but for this purposes, we are talking about eligibility.
You're correct, Amy. You're
Okay.
correct.
I
You
just
are
don't want to
100
get I just don't want to get a finding on eligibility.
Right. No, you will never get a finding if you have documentation, and this never becomes a problem until it's a problem, if that makes sense. And that's when the person is exited. That's when it becomes the problem. So you're right. If it says that they're eligible to work and that day, and it's expired a week from now, you would be correct. It was authorized to work at time of application or certification.
Okay, and Mike Johnson's talking, and so is Mike Herman, is about other sources. We'll look into each of those. We, again, as usual, are recording this session, and we'll have the Word version of all the comments being made, as well as the recording will be out on Illinois Working Up for everybody. So we'll look at each of those instances and see if they are allowable. My guess is the best is if you could print something out that proves you've used another system, upload that to the file. That'd be the best, but case notes would have to support the fact that somebody has gone through the time to utilize one of these other systems and verified the eligibility through that method. As far as Sally's comments, if you identified someone eligible based on the earlier WIOA policy 12 and the documentation sources there, and those maybe aren't there today, well, then that was in the past. until this is issued, we really can't enforce this. However, going forward from today, really you should try to utilize this because we're pretty sure this is a more comprehensive list and a more accurate list. But if you have identified someone and determined them eligible prior to seeing this document and it was on that previous list, we will have to accept that. We can't, de-eligibilize them because something.
And one of the things,
Webster needs that word.
one of the things, IWS is not updated with these selection choices right now. So in the field, your case managers are still seeing what's in 0012 change 2. So until this is issued, and quite frankly, even after it's issued, our programmers are quite buried. We're going to have to maybe do a workaround for some of these different choices, and then case note the particulars, and then once it gets updated in IWDS, I can physically go in and change those documentation choices.
Yeah, would maybe self-attestation with a case note saying you've actually verified it with a document be the best choice, rather than select a document that's not really accurate?
Right, because they have that, there is a section, I think currently in there about self-attestation for the DACA, so maybe something along those lines, because they'd have to make one of the current choices. So we'll have to address that, and the programmers might be able to get this in quick, I don't know. That's something that once we have this document now that we're going forward, we can give them the documents or the choices to update in there.
As far as monitoring, that's just a normal monitoring procedure in my mind, Sal, in the sense that they monitor on what was in effect at the time an occurrence actually occurred. So, if the monitor comes in and looks at somebody determined eligible on July 15th, they'll know that this policy wasn't issued yet, and so they know they have to utilize the 012 policy as their basis. And we in policy know that too, so if someone ever has an issue with that, make sure you let us know that so we can get the proper dates to them when things were issued, if they can't find that document or something like this. Like this isn't actually issued, so if you start utilizing a document on this list that wasn't on the 12, and a monitor says, well, that wasn't in effect yet because we were still under the old policy, this is acceptable starting today. We're giving this to you. Again, we want you to use the most accurate and up-to-date information as possible. We hope to have this issued by next Friday. Obviously, everybody knows how that sometimes doesn't quite work as well as we hope for it, but that we are very close to getting these policies finalized and to our management to get them reviewed and signed off on. So hopefully the actual policies that this document's attached to will be out by next Friday. At the worst, we can at least issue this as a final document through an email just to give you a formal, without a draft mark on it, for you to work forward from. And we're going to go ahead and scoot down to the second page of this particular authorized to work.
I will make one note, and I can't believe or remember who brought up, I think it was Mike Balsick, the DD-214. If you look at a DD-214, it actually doesn't say where the person's born. It's just assumed that if they've been discharged from the military with the DD-214 that they're going to be authorized to work. So I know that questions came up in the past. So it's still why the DD-214 is an acceptable document for almost everything. So.
Hey, Jim,
Yes.
we have another question. What's the difference? I'm getting an echo. All right. What is the difference between the alien registration card indicating right to work and the unexpired employment authorization document issued by the INS? Or just what are those documents?
I have no idea, Amy.
Yeah, there's a lot of these documents we've not heard of. We've gone out to websites to verify through other sources. Wisconsin was actually quite helpful because they did a lot of the legwork on verifying several of these documents, and so we've worked with them to add things to this list that they've already done the legwork on, but we didn't go to the extent of pulling up each of these and seeing what they actually look like. I guess that could be an assignment to a local area that might be willing to spend the time on that to help everybody else out. But no, we really, I know I don't, and obviously I don't work with it daily, but Jim has even expressed that he doesn't know what some of these are, but feels comfortable with them in the sense that there's sources out there that say these are acceptable. So,
And it still would go back to that same, hopefully the case manager's thought process of looking, is this an acceptable document? Not just because it's on the list. If it's not acceptable, if they don't believe this works, even if it's on the list, we wouldn't want them to choose it, hopefully. But if it's a duplicate, Amy, if it just surely is a duplicate, then we could remove it, so if that's the case. And if anybody knows, if those of you that are out in the field that are more versed in this, please look that list over and say, hey, these are the same thing. Let us know. We'd be glad to take things off of there if that's necessary.
okay, and then Maureen's asking, under the birth certificate or baptismal church record, or hospital record, I'm sorry, not birth certificate, we've got that it should include the date. Is it date or place? Do you know which, are we correct in having date there or place there? That's under the third.
How it was
bullet point.
listed in the 0012, it was baptismal certificate if place of birth is shown.
So I put date down there, so that's a mistake we'll have to correct. So thanks for identifying that.
I have a question.
Okay. This is Sheila for monitoring.
Yes, you talked about the identity thing along with the eligibility document, so is that part of our new policy going to be that they're going to have to do the eligibility for right to work and the identity thing? Just trying to make sure that we cover all of our bases on the monitoring.
Jennifer, if you're on still, do we have, I think what we do there is it's an assumed task. We may want to put that in as an actual task. It's an assumed part of determining authorization to work. Don't make
but
right. So, yeah. But I'm just saying I don't think we have that step in policy, and we may need to add that to say you should verify that their identity is accurate. And I mean, I would think that's a normal local area case management step, but we might want to add that too in order to clarify that. So
I think that'd be a good idea.
Okay.
Yes. This is Jennifer with KEB, and I think that's a very good point. In the past, it hasn't been specified to this level of clarity that, number one, need to ensure that the person is who they say they are, and number two, that they're positioned, they're able to prove right to work. So,
okay, so we'll look into adding that, Jennifer. That'd be great. Yeah, someone else have a comment? Okay, someone has asked to clarify some of the DACA thing. That is the last one on the bulleted list of documentation sources. There was a TEGL put out in 2014 that addresses, it's TEGL 02-14, that addresses children, and the DACA stands for Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals. And it refers to when immigrants at a child level and the age range of, I can't find that.
There's several subcategories that a person has to meet underneath that. So you best to reference TEGL 0214 if you run into a client that you believe meets that criteria, because there are several things. They had to be age 31 as of June 15th, 12, came in the United States before their 16th birthday, have continuously resided in the United States since June 15th, 2007 up to present, were physically present in the United States after June 15th, 2012. There's a lot of subcategories on that, so you'd refer to that TEGL for those DACA folks. Get the music going. Did that answer your question? Who had the DACA question? Monica?
And again, for those, if you'd rather voice your question or concern rather than type it, you're more than welcome to, as long as we can keep to a minimum those actual phones that are opened up. So that's the extent of discussion on actual authorized to work in the United States. As you look at that list, you'll become more familiar with what's there, but refer to this going forward. The next and second criteria for just general eligibility for anybody, no matter what program you're entering, is that you're in compliance with military selective service requirements. And as indicated in the explanation, that applies only to males, and only to those born after December 31st, 1959, and who have reached age 18. So we do have policy out on that at this point in time on selective service. It's WIOA policy 11-PL-02 that goes into more detail. We may have to update this to reflect the list on the right, but the items on the right are those things that can be acceptable to prove that they've complied with military selective service requirements. Jim, are there any significant changes to this additions?
There's not a significant change, but while I got everybody on the line, I do want to pass on something that comes up periodically. If somebody was born outside the United States, it's typically like a parent were in the military, they get a selective service number that seems to not appear on the selective service websites. So if that comes up, there ends up being an issue. So that's what you'd contact me directly, because then you have to write off the selective service to get the actual number. So it'd be a kid who's actually tried to register or even registered, but he's not showing up on the selective service website. So we work on those on an individual basis, because we don't want to hold up the process if somebody that has been registered. But you will run into some problems, and some of you might have experienced that already. I just got an email from somebody yesterday that ran into that situation. So again, it's typically for somebody who was born abroad in whatever number they've been given. This is not correlating on the website.
Okay, and we also remove, I think we had a telephone number to contact selective service verification. That number was out of service when we tried it recently, so we've just taken phone numbers off this list. We've given the most current website that you can go to for the selective service site. You'll see it there on page 3. Obviously, websites change regularly, so if you go to that in the future and it doesn't work, you might have to Google or some other search to try and find what that website has changed to. First person that finds that, please let us know so we can update our document. Obviously, we're not going to be out there looking for changes anytime soon. Hopefully, they'll be in existence for a while. To back up, Nick was asking about DACA, DACA, the actual types of documents you need to prove DACA, or that's Monica asking that. And I don't think there are any documentation. That's why we've listed it as self-attestation based on DACA requirements. I think you're going to do an interview with that individual that comes into the facility and says they meet those requirements, and they're just going to have to answer the questions that are required by that TEGL to verify whatever it is, you're trying to reach the age limit or whatever else when they came into the United States, et cetera. And then you would just case note all of that discussion for that individual.
And back to the selective service portion, I do want to make sure everybody's aware, and you run into this when you have to do the waivers for those folks who didn't register for selective service. Again, for folks who entered the country after their 26th birthday, you don't have to wait for a status letter. If the first time they've entered the country is after their 26th birthday, you don't hold it up for a status letter. The same for an individual that's been in the military. You don't need a status letter. So those are some of the things that can speed up the process of obtaining those locally approved waivers for those individuals.
Okay, well, we've still got some comments coming in. I want to move ahead to the next section. We'll note those comments, and at the end, if we have more time, we'll address those. Or, as always, we've come out with posting of these webinars and supporting documentation onto Illinois WorkNet in the WIOA implementation section. We will, at that point in time, when we update the document and load the chat, we can answer those, and everyone can refer to that document. So the next section in here, we start getting into the actual programs and the documentations. First, the eligibility on the left, the eligibility requirement, and then the documentation sources that apply to that on the right. The first section is adult, and there is really only one additional criteria for being determined an adult. You have to meet the general eligibility, and then you have to be at least 18 or older and then you can utilize any of these sources on the right to verify that. And again, going back to the,
佢哋最抵死咧，佢7月1號都未搞到出嚟啊嘛。冇錢咁點啫？咁又要
okay, sorry about that. Thank you for the Illinois WorkNet staff for muting that phone line. But going back to the starting on page 20, that new table about identity and that, obviously these documents would be the type, some of these documents would be the type that don't prove identity, they just prove birth and age and location of birth, or that you've got a driver's license, but they don't prove your identity or that you're able to work in the United States, so you have to work in conjunction with that other table to prove those two items. Anything significant here, Jim, to
Well, the
speak of?
biggest thing is the adult is still those priority programs. Even though it's only talking about 18, the priority programs are the adults that are low income or the adults that are basic skills deficient. I've had a lot of questions come up about if a person, and the recent question was, okay, so if the person is a single individual and they have an income of $100,000 a year, but they're basic skills deficient, they can be certified. And yes, that's correct, adult basic skills deficient. If they're below 9th grade level in math and reading, that's going to qualify them for adult basic skills deficient. And then you have to determine your services that are necessary. Well, if the person's making a good income, I presume your services are going to be generated to get them beyond basic skills deficient. Also, again, the veteran. So if you have an individual who is a veteran who doesn't meet the low income guidelines or the basic skills deficient, he or she would be the next priority of an adult. I don't think yet, is there any guidance, Mark, on priority groups other than those individuals that are basic skills or low income? Because each local area in the past made that determination based on the 51-49%.
Yeah, I think at this point what we're looking at is the state is setting the requirement that WIOA does that says you have to serve priority individuals first. If you have money left over, then it'll be a local decision. So if you want to put a income status on that like you did in the past to serve the other 49%, you can still do that at the local level, so that policy could still remain in effect for that group. Again, though, that's only those that when you have money left after you serve all of the, and then we stress, all of the priority individuals first. All right.
Mark, can you, how do you do that? How do you, without just saying 100% of your customers must be?
Well, I think in my mind, and someone here at the table that's probably more understanding of how things occur in the field or more knowledgeable than me in other ways. To me, when a person comes in the door, you're determining their eligibility. At that point in time, you start utilizing funds to serve that individual. If you have funds and they are a priority individual, you can serve them. If they are not and you have funds and you have a line of people still to serve, then you would have to say, I'm sorry, at this point in time, we have self-services available, but we cannot serve you under the adult program because we have other people that have priority over you. Delicate situation. I don't, again, know best how to answer how you do that at the local level without inciting some, response from that individual, but we don't have control over the fact that those individuals have to be served first as long as you have funding available for them.
I get that, but that's if there's a line, but there's not a line today, but maybe there's a line.
Yeah, I don't know if they're going to have additional guidance to come out in Tegels that says, all right, I think, you have to look at allocations. So if somebody is going to training and we know we have to put out this amount of money for that individual, we better take that off our top line amount of funding available and work our way down. Or is it on the date the other person comes in that's not a priority and you say, well, heck yeah, I got money, we can serve them. We don't have that clarification at this point in time. The NPRM doesn't say that. All it says is the priority group has to be served first. And we can only interpret that the best we can at this point in time.
Okay,
Yeah, I wish we had a clear answer to your question. It's a very good question that obviously every LWIA has got to deal with. But Mike's comment is, that what about a waiting list? If you have a waiting list, I think you go through the waiting list of people that are qualified or who are on the priority list first, especially have a priority list. If you don't, I mean, if you have a waiting list, I think it's when you don't have a waiting list when you have the issue. I mean, we kind of dealt with this and deal with this with veterans because they've had priority with WIA, and so we still, had to make sure that we were addressing them first. Obviously, if we put someone into a service that is not on the priority list because we have funds available, we're not going to kick them out when someone walks in the door that is on the priority list. We've never said that with veterans, and I don't think we would do that with this priority group of low income or basic skills deficient. So it's that initial getting them into services and various levels of services that also needs to be considered. So we here at Department of Commerce will do our best to get guidance out when we have it to help you out in the field. Yeah, and Kim brought up another issue for identifying, can IDS verify the age of 18? And again, we're looking at some of these comments on the left, and we will make sure we look at all of them at the end of this webinar before we publish. And if we think there's something that should be added to the list because, it is a viable source of documentation, we'll add it, especially like those sites, E-Verify or Save for IDS. If we think those are legitimate to use, then we'll add those to this list to say if you want to use these to verify, that's acceptable. So just because we're not answering, we are seeing all the questions. We want to move along. If we don't answer a question, we'll answer it through follow-up guidance and the policy. So again, minimal requirements for the adult population outside of the general and age restriction or requirement. So we'll move into the dislocated worker group, which becomes more extensive, not quite as much as the youth program, but we have about 11 different criteria that someone can qualify under to become a dislocated worker, and those all appear on the left-hand side. Some of those are contingent on something else, so you'll see DW.1, obviously people have probably figured out that our numbering system relates to the program. We had A for adult. We'll have DW for dislocated worker, and then we have OSY and ISY for the youth groups. So if there is a subcategory of qualification or eligibility criteria, then you'll see the 1As and the 1Bs. So Jim, if you'll, and we reiterate the self-attestation. It appears on the list as the last option because we want it to be the last option everywhere that it does appear. Try and find something above self-attestation that would work for proving the eligibility before you rely only on self-attestation. And when you do have self-attestation as the final deciding criteria, make sure you document that in case notes as detailed as possible. Every monitor that I've talked to, monitor the management as well here that have been monitors previously, have been monitors in the past, state you can't give enough case notes. We find too many instances where the case notes really don't support what is being said because they're too minimal. So take the time to identify, also take the time to identify that you've done the work, to do the research, to show that it's taken this amount of time because look at the information I had to go through as a career planner to make this case note. So please, I don't want to stress that too much, but use good case notes to ensure that monitors know what's going on out in the local field with all of our customers.
Well, this is Jim. As for dislocated worker, really our eligibility under WIOA is all the same as was WIA, except it added a new couple of curves. There's the new field for spouse of a veteran who lost their job due to relocation or transfer. That's a new title, and that's so for any veteran, if he or she's married and when they change stations, that spouse could come in and get services under that criteria. Also, under that same criteria is spouse of a veteran who is basically unemployed or underemployed and experiencing difficulty getting a job. So just being the spouse of a veteran, if they're having a hard time getting a job, they can be certified as a dislocated worker under this new criteria of the spouse of a veteran. So this, and don't confuse this with the qualified spouse for priority of service, because that's a total different animal. What this is talking about is an active duty member's spouse. If they're having a difficult time getting a job, they can now be certified under the dislocated worker program. And then all the rest of the criteria has basically stayed the same as it was under WIOA for the dislocated worker title.
Unfortunately, I scrolled down since he was speaking of spouse of veteran. Unfortunately, one of our cells got cut off, so we'll correct that in the final version so that you can read all of the information there under DW5B. But the majority of the documentations for DW dislocated worker didn't change. We may have added a couple minor ones, but for the most part, as Jim said, it was the same as WIOA, so there wasn't a need to change much of that. What we do want to reiterate when we go back to the terminated or laid off DW2 status is that there's a period of time, get back to it here, or I'm sorry, it's under DW1B. I've got that here on page, I'm going blind here, is that page 6 of 24, sorry. Can't read my little footer there. But in Illinois, under WIOA, they say you have to be employed a duration sufficient to demonstrate attachment to the workforce. As in the past, Illinois is going to continue to use 6 months as the qualification amount of time for that. It's kind of attached to UI. So we've utilized the 6 months in that respect. So we have no reason to think we should change that at this point in time, either to reduce it or extend it. And these 6 months applies also as one of the documentation sources under DW1C, I think it is. You'll find that. So
that's the
so just wanted to reiterate that Illinois has made a decision that that definition of attachment to the workforce is 6 months.
And that goes back to the criteria for the tenure for those folks who did not pay into unemployment. If they worked at a job that they were dislocated where they hadn't paid into unemployment, a lot of jobs, churches, railroad, a lot of small private businesses, domestic help, au pairs, housekeepers, people that work for farmers. Nobody's paying into UI on their behalf. So if they worked there 6 months, lost their job, they would meet a tenure requirement for unlikely return. So that's the same criteria that was used under WIOA also, so it hasn't changed.
Yeah, got along. Dave has presented a scenario. We've got a lot of scenarios that come in on a regular basis to Jim and to policy. What we're going to attempt to do in the future with our new policy portal on Illinois WorkNet when it's up is have a kind of a Q&A section for documents that pertain to particular topics of WIOA, and one would be eligibility, where we can put some of these scenarios out there and explain how the decision making would be done, so that case manager or career planners, staff, monitors, etc., can go to that and kind of see how each of these scenarios plays out in making a decision, learn from them, and utilize that kind of formula of decision making to maybe handle the next scenario on your own. The scenario he says here kind of goes back to, while they're a priority group, there's nothing under WIOA that says you have to serve everybody that walks in the door. I'll start the discussion with that without going too much more into detail. But you always have to remember, if somebody doesn't seem like they're going to be a positive outcome, you need to make a decision based on that. And so if someone in this scenario, you know, they are basic skills deficient, they only want to come in for addressing those basic skills deficiencies, is that a good outcome? Is that what we're here to do, or are we really here to get them a job? Now, if that gets them to the job, then you make the decision based on that. So Again, without going into too much detail on career planning, we'll have career planning webinars in the future to kind of go over scenarios and that. Just always consider that, you know, everybody doesn't have to be served that walks in the door, and you need to be serving those people that you know you can help get to that end goal of WIOA, which is a good job. All right, any others under the dislocated worker section, Jim?
Nope, unless there's any questions. Again, it's very, to me, it works really well because it's the same basic criteria under WIA dislocated worker, except it expands it for those spouses of veterans.
I had a question about EW4 replacement maker. He wanted to know what is meant by the collaborative statement under self-attestation.
Okay, question was asking about for a displaced homemaker. Before, when we had our old eligibility policy manual was originally written, the only choice for documentation if there was a spouse that was separated or getting divorced from a spouse, you had to have the documentation from a lawyer or from the judge. What was made a determination that in instances where a person cannot afford to go to an attorney to get a divorce started, but they are truly separated from their spouse, it allows the case or career planner to have the client self-attest to their marital status, that they're separated from their spouse, they're wanting to go through divorce, but whatever the circumstances. Now, I explained it during eligibility policy training. This shouldn't be, if you have any friends that are broke up one day and back together the next, or broke up the next and back together, those probably aren't the folks that we should bring in under that self-attestation. But if the people are out there, you know that they've said, hey, I've been separated from my spouse, I just can't afford to get through a divorce, that's the purpose of those self-attestations. And that was in the old eligibility policy manual. It's addressed back in Appendix C. What Mark had spoke about earlier when he talked about scenarios and how to deal with them, if you look in the current DCEO policy 0012 change 2 and change 3, Appendix C lists a lot of those questions, answers for some of those gray areas about families and about incumbent worker, or intervening employment, and about some of these self-attestations. So that guidance is still out there right now, but I agree fully with Mark that we need to have more of those scenarios out there because there's a lot of those types of common questions. So thanks for bringing that up.
Yeah, and also to piggyback on the WIOA implementation site that we upload webinars, there's a Q&A section there. We want to expand on it a little bit. There's only a couple different topics you can select to issue a question, and then it'll be answered. We want to expand and kind of put all the different sections of WIOA there so you can be more specific, and that way the person that should be addressing it can get to it quicker and respond to it quicker. So we would have eligibility, we would have performance, we would have reporting, we would, all those larger buckets of WIOA. So, but even until we update the Illinois WorkNet site to address various topics, you can still go in there and put a general question and answer, and then we'll build from those questions and our responses, build those documents that I mentioned once we get the new policy portal up there. Several of you probably on this call today have been asked to be a part of a work team to finalize that portal. So some of you are familiar with how that's going to look in the future, but once it is up and running in the next few months, we'll have a webinar to outline exactly how that'll work, how it'll look, how the question and answer section can be addressed from a local perspective. I think, to me, as we go through some of these scenarios and questions, it also throws some other questions in my mind, and something of this nature where we're, as career planners, need to look and focus at some of what we always looking at, and one of the criteria, or one of the services available now is financial assistance. And if someone were to come to me as a career planner and say, I can't afford to get legal separation or divorce, that would start my process of going, all right, what all do you need to get through training? If you don't have the financial means to do that, what else do you not have the financial means to do? And so financial assistance might be one of the top priorities to give that customer to ensure that they're going to be able to complete training if they want to go into training. So, again, that's how my mind works. Hopefully some others agree to that, and how you can utilize one question in a totally different area of your assessment of an individual to lead to something else. So with that, we'll move on unless there's other questions related to dislocated worker. Youth eligibility section is quite extensive. We have a couple more kind of clarifying sentences at the top there. You can all read those. I don't want to rely on those. Read those for you.
Under this out of school and both in school, I've received a lot of questions. There's a section on not attending school for out of school youth. And currently in IWDS, the only choice for documentation is an applicant statement. And I've received lots of emails asking, well, could we use a high school diploma to prove that they're out of school? What that doesn't prove, though, and I ran into this year in data validation, is that high school diploma proves they've graduated, but it doesn't prove that they're not in a college. So that's the reason why we're allowing the applicant statement to be utilized to explain what the educational current status is of a client. So hopefully that answers some folks' questions on that. Currently on the eligibility policy, or the one that we've released today, it says self-attestation. We're going to be switching that to applicant statements. And again, it doesn't have to be anything fancy. The client basically explains, hey, I'm enrolled my freshman year at Lincoln Land. Well, that'd be in school, so I'm not attending any school. So you'd have a high school diploma and a statement saying they're no longer attending any school, and that supports not attending school at the present time.
Yeah, and that's the only one that'll change from self-attestation to a individual statement or applicant statement. All the other self-attestation is still going to remain as self-attestation. We still are looking to get clarification on what attending school is, so that we can then determine what not attending school is. And so we continue. We wish we could have this answered quicker than we're getting it, but we're working with the education system to try and figure out what attending school means. Is it full-time, part-time, for purposes of WIOA? We just don't know those answers. So we will let everyone know the answer to that question as soon as we can get that. If you have a question and that's the only way you can determine somebody eligible is based on that, then let us know. If it's not clear in your mind, let us know, and we'll try to track down some kind of clarification from DOL, if nothing else, the best we can. We've had a couple scenarios where we did get in contact with DOL to get that answered. And so present those to Jim, and we'll do our best to get back to you so you can help that individual and get them qualified as eligible as best as possible.
But back to out-of-school youth, the biggest thing is to understand is majority of the clients for out-of-school youth now are not required to meet low-income requirements. If they have one of the barriers for for out-of-school youth that do not require low income, you don't need to mess with anything. Nothing on the public assistance screen would need to be populated. As far as an expectation to have the documentation, you would still answer the questions appropriately, yes or no, but it's not going to be tied to your eligibility. Now also for the disability barrier for a youth, if a youth has any other of the barriers, they would still mark yes to the disability, but the documentation is not going to be required for the disability. They could just self-attest to what that was, and it's not going to be required at time of certification. So that's a bit of a change from the past. So just to reiterate, if a youth has multiple barriers, one of them being a disability, they're not going to be responsible to provide one of the documentation choices at certification. Your case manager can just have the client attest to it. But if that is their only barrier, the disability, then they are going to have to provide one of the documentation choices that's listed in the documentation list. So that's probably one of the biggest changes for out-of-school youth and in-school youth for the disability, I think. It really opens up a lot easier to serve these out-of-school youth. than it was in the past, in my mind. You guys can probably speak to that better than I. The two, go ahead, you had a question, Amy?
Yeah, I was just a little confused. So if, to document a disability, all a case manager would need would be like a case note saying, you know, I verify that, you know, Joey has a hearing loss, or Joey observes to be deaf or blind, or the customer themselves could attest to their own disability. Is that what you're saying?
Well, two different issues. I want to make sure we're both talking about the same thing. Is this Joey's only disability? Or excuse me, only barrier?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, so it is the only barrier. Then you'd have the choice of what's on page 14 of 24 of choices of documentation.
So if it is the only barrier, we do have to then rely on documentation, not
Correct.
self-attestation.
But if they have any other barrier, then you won't be on the hook for the documentation at certification. That answer your question?
No, because I'm on page 14, which continues on page 15, and it says self-attestation, case notes regarding observable condition.
Right. Remember, those are the bottom level, as we state in the header of all of these groups of populations for the programs. Self-attestation and case notes would be the last resort to providing documentation. Well, you need the documentation. This is the only scenario or the only situation where we have a qualifier otherwise would say is if this is not the only barrier, then you can just go straight with self-attestation. But if this is the only barrier, you have to have some kind of proof that they have a disability to ensure that they're meeting the barrier qualification.
Amy, I'm right on line with you. That needs to be removed in my mind.
Now I'm very confused.
Well, no, but you brought that up, and now that I look at this, I fully see your question. Because it's never been allowed for a disability to utilize a self-attestation for it.
And I'm applauding DCEO.
Well, I understand you're applauding DCEO.
Let me just explain. This is going back this is a big issue of me back from my case management days of working with people who are deaf. You know, it was ridiculous to try and you see that the deafness isn't going away.
No, I fully agree.
It's observable.
Nope, you're 100% right, Amy. That's the reason why I didn't say the case note regarding an observable condition. That's not going away. That's going to be there. The self-attestation needs to go away, because why have the person write a self-attestation about that? You're right. You could observe it. Your case manager could put a case note in stating Jim is deaf and that's his disability, and that would support it. You're 100% right.
Okay, I just didn't want you to remove that.
No,
you know,
the case note's not removed. The self-attestation needs to be removed. The self-attestation would be used in a case where the barrier is not going to support the eligibility. So it wouldn't be one of the choices, because it's not even going to be asked to support the disability if the client has another barrier. So thanks for clearing that up. But most definitely the case note for observable condition, that is going to be staying there, and that is a choice.
okay.
And again, back to this out-of-school youth, we do want them to populate as many barriers as possible, just because the regression analysis for performance. The more barriers your client has, it gives you bargaining steps of why your clients are more difficult to serve than other folks. If you have an average of 3.2 barriers per youth client compared to somebody who has less. So make sure your clients, your career planners are capturing the true essence of the client's situation to give you guys the most bang for your buck when you're serving folks. And then also in the ISS, the service strategy, would be addressing, if necessary, how we can help them overcome some of these barriers, whether it be homeless or whether it be basic skills deficient, whatever the circumstances are. But most definitely we want to document as many barriers as possible. Back, one last thing for out-of-school youth. There are 2 barriers that do require low income. That's if you use youth needing assistance or the individual who's graduated high school or earned a GED, but they're still basic skills deficient. Either of those barriers, if you don't have any other barriers but one of those, the client is going to have to meet low income requirements in order to get certified as an out-of-school youth. Youth needing assistance, and that's based on the assessment. The only documentation to be allowed would be your local policy. Each local area chooses the criteria for youth needing assistance. But again, if you use, you'd only really want to use youth needing assistance if your client has no other barrier. Because any of the other barriers, other than the high school graduate or equivalent with the GED, doesn't have to be low income. So to benefit your client, the one that is not making you prove low income would be the one you'd utilize. So save youth needing assistance for those clients who do not have any of the other barriers that would make them eligible. Does that make sense?
Okay, we've got a few questions here we can address in the out-of-school youth section. Can UI documentation to show termination or laid off, is that an acceptable form of documentation? I guess that would have been on the dislocated worker, but...
Yes, for a dislocation date, a UI document would be a proper document. If it's not on the list, it should be on the list. I don't know, I passed the dislocated worker section, but yes, most definitely, because we accept that. We accept the applicant statement of their dislocation date. We accept UI, we accept the layoff letters. So whatever documentation the client provides you to support his or her dislocation. Anything on the youth while we're here at this section?
Chelsea, Rory would like to speak. I don't know if you've got, but Rory, we need your telephone number in the chat pod, unfortunately, in order for her to, or if you want to send it to me as a private so you don't share the actual phone number.
Well,
okay, so Chelsea, can you unmute Rory if he's muted there?
And to answer Curtis's question, again, for out-of-school youth, if they have any of the barriers that's specified, other than youth needing assistance or other than the individual who's a high school graduate or earned a GED and basic skills deficient, those 2 must be low income. Any of the other barriers for an out-of-school youth do not require you to support low income. So those would be a dropout, within age of compulsory school attendance but has not attended school in at least the most current calendar quarter as defined by the school, is a foster kid, aged out of foster kid, pregnant, pairing, has a disability, is a runaway, is homeless. Any of those criteria do not require to support low income. Now those of you that know low income will realize that foster child and homeless is actually an automatic low income qualifier. But what's going to happen on your eligibility certification, it just won't show up as required to certify for low income. It would just show up as the barrier of foster child or homeless. Another new barrier for the out-of-school and in-school youth are aged out of foster care. That was new, that had never been a previous barrier. And then the disability, which is now a barrier. In the past, under WIOA, youth having a disability was not a barrier to support eligibility. So again, any of those barriers other than youth needing assistance, you're going to be required to be low income if that's the only barrier, or the individual who graduated high school or earned a GED and is basic skills deficient.
Okay, how long does someone have to be out of school or not in school to actually be considered as out of school? It's a quarter, isn't it?
No, it's going to be based on your application. So let's say Mark Burgess is my client, and he graduated high school in June, and he comes to see me after he graduated high school. He's no longer in school. He's graduated high school. So I don't believe there's a time limit. Now, for those who are dropping out of high school, those are the ones that you have the age of the quarter. That's what it talks about when it states and you guys don't have the policy out yet, but how it's written in the law is within the age of compulsory attendance, but has not attended school for at least the most complete school year calendar quarter, as defined by the school district. So again, your school district is going to make that determination. I think they put that in there because in some instances, schools wouldn't give dropout letters till the end of a year. So some clients could run into some issues. So in this, it's giving you guidance of the school quarter for those who stop attending. But you'd have to get that from your school.
Okay, and then Mike is asking if there's an applicant statement stating the youth is a high school dropout, doesn't have a high school equivalency certificate, or does there need to be, is that sufficient enough, or does there need to be some other separate statements?
Whatever the documentation is for school dropout, it says attendance record, dropout letter, school record indicating non-attendance, or self-attestation. This goes back to the original statement from Mark. If there's not an attendance record, a dropout letter, or a school record indicating non-attendance, then the client would self-attest that he or she dropped out of school, and you wouldn't have to be low income because that's not a criteria under the out-of-school youth for somebody to drop out. IWDS will determine that person eligible as out-of-school youth, barring if it's a male, he's compliant with selective service.
All right, Rory, are you on? I know you had a question.
I am, I did, and actually I apologize, I don't think you guys muted me. I had turned the mic feature off so that, my background noise wouldn't be heard, but then I was trying to talk a few minutes ago and I was like, hey, I'm muted. But I had it goes back to the dislocated worker thing, and I can wait if you want until the end. I was trying to talk back when you guys were still at the end of the dislocated worker thing.
Well,
I was going to say I've looked at some of the other comments, and I had kind of the same question too. I think the confusion is when you go back to page 5 under the dislocated worker eligibility requirements, you have DW period 1 period. So like the general terminated or laid off or has received notice of employment termination or laid off in that first row of the table on page 5, the IDES, a printout of their UI claim, like the IDES unemployment insurance records, is not listed in that first row for like just the basic foundation of dislocated worker eligibility of being terminated or laid off or received notice. But it is down there on DW.1A, point A. There is for eligible for or is exhausted unemployment insurance. I do see the bullet point there, but I think we were wondering. I think we were just asking if that should also be in the cell in the row above.
Yeah.
You're right. It should be, Rory.
Okay. Bye.
Okay, great. Yeah, good comment. All right, we'll drop back down and we'll move on to in-school youth.
So in-school youth, you still have the situation specifying first for attending school. It's going to be an applicant statement or verification from the educational institute. So if you have something from whatever school the individual's attending, that would definitely be acceptable. Right now, IWDS doesn't have that verification from educational institution of enrollment for the in-school. But it needs to go in there. So right now it just has applicant statement, but you're just specifying that the individual is in fact in school. And then the big difference now for in-school youth as compared to out-of-school youth, all of them must meet low-income requirements. So with the exception, there is a 5% window. So 5% who do not meet low income, if they have one or more of the barriers, can get services. Each of your local areas are going to determine, same as you always have for that 5%, who you're going to choose to serve, if you're going to set up a criteria of barriers or ever how you determine that. But the biggest thing for in-school is they're going to have to meet low-income requirements. And also back to out-of-school youth, there is a 5% window for out-of-school youth also. But again, that would only be for the out-of-school youth who had no other barriers but youth needing assistance, and or they've graduated high school, or earned a GED and are basic skills deficient. So it's a really small group for the 5% for the out-of-school, since there's no low-income requirements on most of the criteria. For in-school youth, again, all clients other than the 5% must be low-income regardless of what their barriers are. And then we'll speak a little bit later in regards to low income, so I won't get into that right now. So any questions on in-school? One of the things I do want to bring up, that English language learner, that's a question that comes up for in-school youth. So how it works in our system is if a client is basic skills deficient, meaning 8.9 or below on math or reading, the system's going to make that determination if that client meets that barrier. Also, if your career or if your career planners checks yes to the English language learner question, it's going to determine that basic skills deficient also, because that's a criteria that is under in-school youth is the English language learner. It also works the same for the adults, regressing back to the adult basic skills deficient. If a client under the adult funding stream, if the answer is yes to English language learner, they're going to be determined adult basic skills deficient. So I should have brought that up back then. Sorry about that. One of the differences also for in-school youth, you'll notice offender is the barrier. If you look back at out-of-school youth, it's actually not titled offender. It's titled that somebody has been
Juvenile justice system. Yeah.
subject to the juvenile adult justice system. So there's a little bit of difference there. The offender definition is basically anybody that's had any dealings with the police that could possibly, or any law enforcement that could possibly be a barrier for them getting a job. It's a very, very broad definition. It's currently in the Eligibility Policy Manual 0012 Change 2 in Appendix A, and it is a real broad definition for offenders. So the offender is actually a broader definition than subject to the juvenile or adult justice system.
Here's some of the questions we got, just to reiterate what Jim has said already. Anytime you're wondering if self-attestation or an applicant statement is acceptable, you have to first look at this table and determine the documents that could otherwise be provided to provide, as proof of that situation. Only when none of those are available would you then rely on maybe a self-attestation as your means to determine their eligibility. So if somebody is no longer going to school, it's either because they've graduated, and if they've graduated, they become eligible as out-of-school youth immediately because they've graduated, or they have dropped out. And if they've dropped out, you have to wait 1 quarter according to your school system, whatever that is. And I believe the question to that is, some of these school systems that have gone to year-round schools, what is a quarter now? In the past, it was 2.5 months. It just was pretty easy because a quarter was part of 9 months. Take away the 3 months of summer. So you just have to know what your school districts have, where that individual would be dropping out of, and determine it based on what that school district has as a quarter. And again, back to the documentation, self-attestation is the last resort for proving any of these. You should also always look for that documentation first. So if someone's a dropout and they say they're a dropout, you should ask, do we have any kind of documentation from that school that says they've not attended for 90 days or what have you, and then you could determine that they actually are a dropout. If they've not attended for the last week, they're not a dropout yet. They might go back to school tomorrow. We don't want to consider them a dropout until that quarter has passed.
I have a question. This is Toriana from WIOA 17. I guess this would be probably for Jim. There is something in the law about, if I'm right, Title II fund. Hello?
We were going to do it downstairs so Corinne's not by herself.
Hello?
Could whoever doesn't have their phone muted, please mute and let this individual speak, please. Thank you.
Okay, isn't there something where if a participant is attending Title II fund program, so like a GED program, then they are automatically considered out of school?
At this time, I'm not aware of that. Our policy's
No.
not written to address that unless there's something when we get these discussions done with the education system that says that's considered out of school. I don't know that we can assume that that would be acceptable.
I think there has been discussion along the lines of the difference of enrolled in like a GED prep school maybe compared to being enrolled in GED. I thought there was some discussion on that, but we'll let Mark do the research with adult ed because that's something that the state does have to define.
Okay.
And we don't have it defined right now in the policies, but it's going to be something that there was some, and it falls under the adult ed definition. I remember reading something about also, but that's going to need to, the state is going to have to define that, so it's a really a good question.
All right, one of the, and this may be a wording on our part, is 21 included in in-school youth or younger than 21?
No, it's 21.
Okay. There's someone stating that it's up to 21, but it does include 21, so as we've listed it here in ISY.2 is correct. They can't be older than 21, so 21 would be allowed.
Right. It's the same way it was under WIOA. You could be certified up to the age of 21. If you got certified the day before you turned 22, you were certified and could receive services all the way until you finished. There was no exit because you turned 22. Well, that's the same way it is for the in-school youth. He or she can be certified up to age 22, so prior to 22. And then it's based on whatever your service strategy is for that individual. And the same for out of school up to 24 now.
We're bouncing around a little bit here, and I'm not necessarily following on the slides as well, and we had someone comment that it's hard to follow if I don't get to that. What I did is I took it off where I was controlling the pages for everybody, so you can now scroll through these pages. Most people, if you've downloaded and printed off the version, you can follow your paper copy. But so I'm not going to scroll through these pages for everyone through the rest of this presentation.
But hopefully what we can do, because we are running in a little bit of time, I do want to get to the income portion. That's the last, or second to last section, I think. There are some differences for low income now. You still have all the particulars that were under WIA, but there is a little bit of a caveat difference. Now, food stamps is no longer based on household. Food stamps is based on family, so it's the same criteria you would have used in the past for cash welfare recipients. They don't have to show up on the food stamp printouts. They have to be meeting the requirements of the family. So that is a pretty significant difference. One of the things WIOA under Title II didn't define family. So we're utilizing the WIA definition for family until we get further guidance from the Department of Labor. So that'd be husband, wife, dependent children, parent, guardian, dependent children, husband or wife. And then you do have the same-sex marriages, so that's recognized by a TEGL that was put out. So those criteria still meet, husband, husband, wife, wife. But it's still, so for food stamps, that's a major change. They no longer have to be on the food stamp printouts. You would have to show that somebody within that family is receiving the food stamps and how that client fits into that family. So that's a change. Another change in the past, cash welfare was the client or a member of their family had to currently be on cash welfare. Under WIOA, it goes back up to 6 months. So that's a benefit. It gives you a little more latitude. So if the individual or is a member of a family that has been on a form of cash welfare, which would be TANF, SSI, Supplemental Security Income, some block grants fall into that category, a refugee assistance, that's a form of cash welfare. So any of those criteria, it can be up to currently or up to the previous 6 months to application. So those are two of the significant changes under the food stamps and cash welfare. Then we've also added for in-school youth the criteria for receives the reduced or free school lunches. So that would make any in-school youth, you would get the documentation from the school system that states that this individual is on free or reduced price lunch. That's an automatic low-income qualification factor for the youth. It has no tie to any of low income for an adult client or an out-of-school youth. It's only tied for the in-school use criteria. And then you have the new criteria about living in high poverty zone areas. That hasn't been ironed out yet through our policy unit. I know they're doing a lot of work on it. So if you have a client who's an in-school youth who doesn't meet any of the other low-income qualifications, but you think they do meet that criteria of the high poverty area, contact Mark Burgess or myself directly, and we'll be glad to work with you to make sure that we have the proper documentation on it. But that would be a last case if they wouldn't meet any of the other criteria until that gets ironed out. Once hopefully it gets ironed out in the near future and there's clear guidance out, but right now we don't have anything. All the rest, the income is the same. You still, if they don't meet any of the public assistance, if they're not homeless, if they're not a foster child, you have to do a family income calculation. And that's where the current policy that's out about low income with the charts are still utilized, which is the policy WIOA Notice 14.02 that was put out 22 April. That's still relevant for the income charts. And again, it's the 70% of the lower living standard income level based on the family size. There still are family of one due to a disability. So if a client is not on a form of public assistance or part of a family, if he or she's income is, the family income's over, but if that individual has a disability, you could utilize that individual's own income to support eligibility under a family of one due to disability. So that's the same requirement or criteria that was available under WIOA, so that stays again for WIOA. And then of course, like I had mentioned earlier, foster child is an automatic low income qualifier, as well as homeless is an automatic low income qualifier. So that was a quick down and dirty on low income.
All right, we'll jump back to page 20 where we started the day, talking about the acceptable documents for identifying identity or employment eligibility. We'll take care of that here in a second, sorry. So on page 20, we have this new document that wasn't in the old policy that talks about verifying identity. What you'll notice is the documents on the left column of these three are all also found in the authorized to work in the United States section found on page 1 and maybe on page 2 as well. Because they prove both identity and that you're eligible to work in the you're eligible to have employment. Some people might be legally here, but they aren't eligible to work for whatever reasons. So the column on left proves both of those things. The columns on the right, the middle and the right, prove one or the other. So if you are trying to prove their identity and all you have is a Social Security card, that's not going to do it. That proves they can be employed, doesn't prove who they are, because I can find anybody's Social Security card laying on the ground, walk in a door and say, I'm this person. So that's the theory behind proving both of these. And on the converse side of it, if I've got a driver's license, that doesn't mean I'm eligible to be employed in the United States for whatever reasons that might be. It proves who I am, but it doesn't prove the other half. So, the career planners just need to utilize this. Most times, I don't think it's going to be really a question proving identity and things of that nature. I don't know how you handle it now as far as that. But this is just an added resource that'll help everybody to ensure that whatever they're taking in from the customer as documentation is proving what they need to prove. So we won't talk about it anymore. If somebody has additional documentations they think should be added to this, by all means let us know on any of these columns and we can add them to it. And then we'll, like Jim said, we're running out of time. We've got all your questions on the left. We'll attend to those. This is one of the few, if not maybe the first of all of our webinars where we weren't able to answer the questions in the time we were allotted. For the most part, we've been able to allow enough time to answer those. I kind of presumed we might get to this point of a lot of scenarios out there that people have. And so we'll do our best to answer each and every one of those in a document that will be placed on the Illinois WorkNet site along with this video. So the last document, I want to take the last couple minutes, and we're running a little bit over, just supports that somebody is a veteran. This is the last page of your document, page 24. I've scrolled down to it and popped everyone there, so hopefully everyone is here. But there's 4 documents here that prove somebody's veteran status. Jim also already talked about when a qualified spouse of a veteran comes into play. We're trying to determine what we want to do here because as you read the definition there next to qualified spouse of a veteran, there's various different things there. And do we want to have a list on the right, or can we even have a comprehensive enough list to address every single one of those? So if I'm a spouse of somebody who's has a service-connected disability, what all sources would support that? Or someone who died from a service-related or connected disability, or has been missing in action. And we think because this comes up so few times that in the years Jim's been around, and if somebody in the local area has been around longer than that and thinks it's come up more often and thinks we should put a list up here and start compiling one, we can look into it. But we think it occurs so infrequently that to put a list up here that probably isn't 100% accurate or comprehensive enough, more so than accurate, might be doing disservice rather than you just call us and say, hey, we think we've got an individual that's a qualified spouse. Can you help us determine if they are for sure? So that's why we've left that to be determined. If we get enough comments that says we'd like a list put up there, we're going to have to work with, amongst ourselves as well as with you out in the field that have done this over the years to get a comprehensive enough list to address all of those situations that might qualify someone as a spouse of a veteran.
And one last thing on that thought process, both the veteran and the qualified spouse of a veteran, these deal with the priority of service. Those 2 criteria do not make anybody automatically eligible for any WIOA programs. It does make them a priority. So being a veteran or a qualified spouse would make them a priority for the adult program. It would make them a priority for any program of service first. If we're getting ready to run out of money and the client is a qualified veteran or a qualified spouse, he or she must get served before any of other individuals. So again, they're not tied to eligibility, they are tied to the priority of service. Again, the qualified spouse, you're dealing with a really small niche market because it's got to be the spouse of a veteran who's 100% service-connected disabled, the spouse of a veteran who died of a service-connected disability, or the spouse of a veteran who's captured, detained, or forcibly detained by more than, I think, 90 days by a foreign power. So there's very few folks that I've heard over the years that come into that. Sometimes people will populate the qualified spouse incorrectly because they'll say, well, I'm married to a guy who's a vet, so I must be a qualified spouse. But that's not the situation. They must meet that small group of criteria. But again, that's on the veterans information screen of an application. If you say yes or a qualified spouse, you do have to have documentation to support that, and it is going to make the person a priority with that documentation for service.
Okay, I think we got through an awful lot of information. We definitely have some work to do on our end with all the questions that were presented. For those that asked, why can't this or that be used for documentation, we will be looking at each and every one of those on an individual basis, look and see if it should be added to one or more sections of this document, and we'll have it updated when we issue this as final. For all the other questions that were scenario kind of questions, we'll do our best to put it in a Q&A or other document, again on Illinois WorkNet. If Jennifer Butler has any final comments, please let us know. Otherwise, we've utilized our time for the day. We appreciate you even going over a few minutes. So I'll let Jim appreciate all your time and insight on these various situations related to eligibility. Appreciate everybody else's input as well. But Jennifer, if you want to comment anything further, please do.
I think the feedback once again was really strong and gives us some clarifying input that we need to incorporate into the policies. The questions that you ask will help us shape up and tighten our language in the supporting documentation chart as well as those policies. So we appreciate the time and attention, and hopefully we'll be able to take these to the next level and get them finalized as soon as possible, because I know everyone's anxious to have these as working documents. Thank you.
Thanks, Jennifer. We've lost a few people here at the end. We've had, I think, maybe our largest group to date for a webinar. We were up to almost 150, if not over that. But for those of you here, staff that you have, coworkers that weren't able to attend, if you could get any other questions or scenarios to Jim or myself by, let's say, close of business Friday, so that we can incorporate that, because we incorporate those as necessary, because we do want to finalize these and get them to review and approval by the end of next week. So any other new ones that you can get us, and we can then look over first thing next week and incorporate as necessary, would be very helpful. So if somebody needs our emails, I'll type our emails in the chat pod here, so you can directly send them to Jim and myself. But again, appreciate everybody's involvement, and we will be having another webinar next week. We have not yet tied down what that topic will be, but at this point we do plan on having another one and continue doing these on Wednesdays until we feel someone doesn't think they're necessary, or we don't have the topic for a particular week. But we've got a lot of positive feedback from everybody. We appreciate that feedback. It supports